pleasure to welcome you all to the Elliott School today for a discussion about science and technology diplomacy in the context of the new U.S. Techno-Industrial strategy. There's been a lot of talk recently about the new U.S. industrial policy, especially after the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, both passed last year. Although the term industrial policy is controversial, it has become more commonly used in the context of U.S. economic and security competition with China. Industrial policy means different things to different audiences. It includes public investment in key sectors like semiconductors, but it also involves tax credits, rebates, tariffs, export controls, and investment restrictions. The Biden administration insists that new U.S. industrial policy is not about picking winners and that it's not protectionist. It also emphasizes international engagement with key partners and allies. But how do we reconcile cooperation with partners on key technologies while competing with those same partners in certain market sectors, for example, semiconductors and electric vehicles? How do we best coordinate industrial policies with partners to tackle the common security and economic challenges posed by China? And finally, what is the role of science and technology diplomacy in furthering these efforts? To address these questions and more, we have assembled a great panel with diplomats from the United States, Japan, and the European Union, as well as experts from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. But first, we're honored to hear from Dr. Seth Center, one of the key figures tackling these questions at the U.S. State Department. He is the Deputy Envoy for Critical and Emerging Technologies, a post he took up in January of this year. The new office he leads aims to strengthen U.S. tech diplomacy. It's part of the wider modernization effort at state and across the U.S. government to make the United States more competitive in the technologies of the future, including AI, quantum, and biotech. Dr. Center has held many key positions, including as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff, where he helped to develop the department's cyberspace and emerging technology strategic framework, and as a senior advisor to the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, where he led the writing of the commission's final report. We're delighted to welcome him here today as a part of the Elliott School's ongoing mission to bring together both the academic and policymaking communities to discuss the most urgent challenges of the day. Dr. Center, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Aaron, and appreciate the Elliott School hosting me. Bridging the academic divide between policy and scholarship has been something that I've been working on for more than a decade. So I'm more than thrilled to be here to talk about it in a technology context. The real experts in our S&T diplomacy are here with us, and they'll be on a panel. I am just an interloper in most of this, and so I'll do my best to explain it. And Aaron, I think you framed the issues beautifully. So I actually did teach here at the Elliott School about 10 years ago, and I taught an international history class. And I'm thinking 10 years on how out of touch my syllabus would look to any student or professor who would try and teach the same set of issues today. It covered everything, sort of later half of the 20th century. So Cold War, geopolitics, ideology, development, classic undergraduate class, sweeping history. I had almost no science in there. I definitely had nothing about technology or technology competition. And it's almost embarrassing thinking back on that framing. And what it taught me as I thought about this morning was how much we're conditioned by our contemporary circumstances in terms of not only how we understand the past, but how we focus and frame issues today. If I taught that same class now, I would have spent a whole session on Sputnik, about the microelectronics revolution. I would have talked about the computing revolution, which no one appreciated the profoundness of it in a geopolitical context in the 1970s, let alone the disruptive effects it was going to have on societies. But it was all going on in this period. So now you couldn't imagine talking about geopolitics or international politics or diplomacy in the absence of talking about science and technology. They are at the center. And so, as Aaron said, I'll try and situate the administration's approach and then make a few provocations or suggestions about what it means for S&T diplomacy. The architecture of international politics, as I think everybody in this room appreciates probably more than anyone, is centered around technology. And our national security strategy in the United States prioritizes it. I was struck. I went through and I did what any responsible undergraduate would do. I Googled our national security strategy, and then I hit Control F and I searched for science and technology in the national security strategy just to see. Usually this is the rough barometer for we can tell how important things are. Yeah, state that. And science was only talked about 10 times. So I said, okay, that's unusual. Technology was talked about 89 times. And so my first inclination as I was thinking about this and the reaction of my science friends was, oh my gosh, we have de-elevated science in our national security policy. In fact, that is not the case. What we have done is we've merged in many ways our science and technology diplomacy together. They're part of a continuum, all bound within a larger framework. And I think that's an important component of this to keep in mind. In some ways, I think as Jason will lay out, the depth of the S&T diplomacy that we have at the State Department and the United States government is extraordinary. It's not new, but the context in which it's taking place is new. And I think that's what I'll focus on today. So why are we talking about technology and science in national security today? There's 6 reasons. I think some of them are obvious. One, foundational technologies are transforming the world. They roll off the tip of our tongue now. We almost take for granted. We say them almost as a ritual incantation together. What are they? AI, biotech, quantum. We just say them. And then we all just assume that we know what this means. And then to that, we could add either 11 or 3 more emerging technologies to the United States list. I think the EU has its own critical technology list. Japan has its own list. But the point is that there are a series of technologies that are posing really interesting impacts on our societies. They're having huge implications for how our economies are going to develop. And of course, they're going to have really, really serious consequences for the security environment that we're living in. Secretary Blinken gave a speech about some of this recently, and he quoted Thomas Edison, who said of electricity around the turn of the 19th and 20th century, it is this field of fields that holds the power to reorganize the world. So that's very interesting. And you could say that about AI today, but what's even more interesting is you could say if quantum computing becomes a reality, which I think the science says it will in the next somewhere between 5 and 30 years, that will be the reorganizing factor. If you're deeply involved in the biotech future, you would say, no, it's biotech that's going to transform the world. And so we have each of these technologies which cuts across security, values, economics that are hitting at the same time. That in and of itself would be a reason to elevate S&T diplomacy. But actually, we have another force at play, and that is intensifying strategic competition with the PRC. Almost none of this would be talked about in the same light in the absence of that intensifying competition. What are the dynamics at play? You have a top-down authoritarian state dedicating massive resources to achieving technological dominance in all of the key technology areas. The track record of development, technological, economic research on these is pretty impressive if you look at their trajectory from the 1980s till today. And so that has to shape how the United States and its partners think about technological evolution. And it helps to explain why the United States has taken a new approach to investing in technology. Third, and this is the geography of technology, the way in which this competition against the backdrop of these foundational technologies is playing out is actually geographic. As countries and companies expand in the search of markets, whether we like to talk about it or not, choices are made. You choose whether you want an iPhone or an Android phone, right? And that's a commercial choice. Countries that think about making choices about what kind of telecom infrastructure to embrace, what kind of platforms to move their public services onto are making choices. And those choices will have implications if one of those technology firms or technology systems or standards development components is controlled by a state, not a commercial actor. And so what's emerging de facto, and this is not a policy choice of the United States, in fact, it's the opposite of a policy choice of the United States, is in some sense, you could talk about geography of spheres of technology. That's a dynamic, not a policy pursuit. It's just a reality of the world that we're entering into. And we see this in all kinds of different ways playing out. So that's another feature of the landscape that we're dealing with right now. And then that leads to the heart of the conversation is what are the United States and its partners doing about this? Aaron laid out the core components. The United States has embraced a modern innovation and an industrial strategy. And it is encouraging its partners to come along with it to make those same kinds of investments. $52 billion in reinvestment in a microelectronics industry is obviously the capstone of this administration's approach. That's 39 billion basically in subsidies to encourage fabrication, and then another 11 to 13 billion devoted to next generation research and development. So that's a pretty substantial down payment in a new approach. As Aaron said, Inflation Reduction Act is the other component of this, or the second pillar. And that's a different approach with the same goal, the goal being the revitalization or renovation of an innovation ecosystem to deal with a core issue, in this case, the energy transition, driven both by competition for the future of that economy, but also obviously the accelerating risk of climate crisis. But there are other pieces of this which have not received as much attention, probably because there aren't billions of dollars associated with the public policy choices. I'll just flag a few. One is NSF's decision to establish a directorate for technology innovation and partnership. That's important because it suggests the way in which we're thinking about the relationship between science and technology is changing. The imperative of going from basic science to commercialization and application against the backdrop of strategic competition is increasing. And we've turned to our science agencies to think also about that translation of research in a new way. I think it's the first new director at NSF in something like 3 decades. So this represents a fairly substantial shift in how the United States is thinking about policy at home. The other dynamic of this, which is important, and this we see playing out particularly in the AI space right now, is that a whole series of really important governance choices are being made around these technologies right now all over the world. And they're all driven and being made in a domestic regulatory, legal, legislative framework in which there is a diplomatic component to it, but the agency, the ability of diplomats to affect these changes on a domestic level is limited. And this is sort of the paradox of technology diplomacy today, is we are deeply engaged, more engaged than we've ever been on these issues, but almost all of the agency runs through domestic organizations. And so it's an interesting challenge that we have right now. And that gets to the sort of last point I would make, which is as the United States and other countries are elevating S&T diplomacy, and we're doing it organizationally at the State Department by building offices like mine, creating positions like mine, the Cyberspace and Digital Bureau, adding new resources to Jason's team and STC, building out an entire component of our security team so they'll understand the security implications of these emerging technologies, building out a team that can understand the nature of supply chains and clean technologies and microelectronics, which the State Department never had before. As we're building all of this out to reinforce this larger architecture, almost all of, or at least the dominant agency resides in domestic decisions across the board. So we're going to play our part in these things, but they're being driven domestically. So against that backdrop, what is the United States actually trying to do with its technology diplomacy? I'll just go through the pillars very quickly, and then I'll dive into a couple of points that I think will be a useful place to have a conversation around the future of this diplomacy. Pillar 1, what does it mean to build a shared technological future with partners? This sounds sort of airy, but in reality, the number one test we really have in our technology diplomacy is to demonstrate around the world that democracies can absorb, integrate, and develop technologies in ways that are consistent with and strengthen our societies. Xi Jinping obviously has said publicly that he doesn't think democracies can pass the tech test. They don't move quickly enough. They aren't flexible enough. They can't devote the resources. And so the wave of the future is authoritarian. And so there is this really interesting question of how do democracies work together to absorb and develop these technologies? And of course, the question of the day is, how do we do this in AI. We could have another 3-hour discussion about what AI governance looks like. And trust me, I've had that conversation many times in the last few weeks, and we can do that at a different time. Closely related to this is, what does it mean to shape the rules of the road for these foundational technologies for which in many cases we don't have rules? You could look at synthetic biology as case in point, where if we can indeed program the human genome, we don't just snip it anymore. CRISPR essentially 10 years ago, you could snip DNA. Now we can basically program it on a computer. That has huge consequences: ethical, normative, financial, security. We don't really have an international regime for dealing with it. So we're going to have to build rules of the road for these technology regimes. In the context of the geography of strategic competition and technology, we are going to have to figure out where we want to preserve positions of strength and contest efforts to build alternative digital and technological architectures. We started in 2019 thinking about this in the context of 5G and what trusted telecom looks like. It's going to be across the whole range of technology issues. We're going to have the same kind of conversation in the future. So that is going to be a core component of technology. Then the piece that really hits hardest on the science component of this, which is, what does it mean to rewire technology ecosystems to strengthen the networks of people, companies, research agendas with our partners? And I'll come back to Japan as one of our most important partners, where we have some great case studies in trying to rewire ecosystems. This has often been talked about in the last year or two, narrowly in terms of supply chains, right? What does it look like to create integrated supply chains that run through trusted, diverse, resilient countries, which is a euphemism that all of us understand, but that's the rubric we're talking about now. That same principle has to apply also to thinking about science and research agendas as well, as we think about where the thickness and depth of the research relationships are, the collaborative relationships, and where we would like them to be strengthened. And I think you could say we have a compelling interest in strengthening our R&D relationships with EU universities, with Japanese universities, Korean universities, Indian universities. And then the challenge that Jason's team is leading in part is, how do we actually rewire those R&D relationships? How do we demonstrate and then create different networks of collaboration? And then the fifth piece of this is, what does it mean in a technology competition to close off competitors' pathways to advantage in narrow technology areas, which we can link either to human rights abuses or to military applications? This has gotten a lot of attention in the context of export controls on high-end chips. And then it has been embellished into a charge that the United States is interested in decoupling entirely from China. That is an incredibly false narrative perpetuated by the PRC. What we have done is essentially the same thing we have always done in looking at the risk between technology and strategic adversaries' capabilities, competitors' capabilities, and that is to make sure that certain sets of technologies are not available that are going to drive military technological change that are going to transform the balance of power. It just so happens what's interesting today is the technologies have changed and therefore attention has changed, but the principles are exactly the same as they've always been. And so that's a core component of this as well. So how does this environment and this agenda reflect specifically on S&T? I'll just put three things on the table, and maybe they're worth talking about as a panel. One is, and this is really interesting on the science side, the question of research integrity has become a core issue of science diplomacy in a way that it would not have been a decade ago. The G7's recent statement from Sendai on S&T and our Japanese partners were critical in developing this agenda, is to secure and support open research. And one of the key passages, and I'll quote this because it's worth talking about as an agenda item for science diplomacy from the G7, is, we share a growing concern that actors may attempt to unfairly exploit or distort open research environments and misappropriate research results for economic, strategic, geopolitical, and military purposes, undermining the principles and values that underpin open, transparent, reciprocal, and accountable research cooperation and the integrity of research. And so what we have is this tension between upholding research integrity and the foundational belief of our entire history of science, which is that open science is good for the world, it's good for the national interest, it's good for our innovation, and it's ultimately good for our economy and our national security. And here we have a dynamic emerging in which this research integrity question comes into play in new and profound ways. The second new dimension of the S&T diplomacy dynamic is the extent to which ideology now infuses the conversation. We now talk about values in the context of science diplomacy in a way that we would not have talked about 10 years ago. And in part, it comes back to that contest between democracies and authoritarianism and the way in which that is shaping how we're thinking about these issues. It's striking. If you look at almost every technology-related forum that the United States and its partners are participating in right now, whether it's the high-level panel that I just participated in Japan, or the similar one in Korea. Jason was just at one in Taiwan. Right now, the US and EU are talking about technology in Sweden, and I wish we were all there with them because it is nice to be in that part of the world right now. All of them have as the lead component of an S&T conversation the importance of values and rights-affirming technology, both in how they're designed and how they're deployed. That is a striking change for a science diplomacy agenda, dictated again by this larger strategic backdrop that we're talking about. And then the third piece of this is the extent to which standards development has become a core component of the science and technology diplomacy agenda. The United States just released a national critical emerging technology standards strategy, which reflects some of this. And it's in almost all of our science and technology dialogues with our partners now is how do we affirm a multi-stakeholder, technologically supported, non-political standards development for these technologies. So if those are the three new issues, there's one other piece of this, which is the hard one, which is how do we actually rewire technology ecosystems to support these principles against the backdrop of this larger context. And I'll just provide a couple examples, and they came right out of the successful meetings between the United States and Japan and at the G7 2 weeks ago now. Secretary Blinken said at the launch of a really successful US-Japan technology partnership, we spend a lot of time doing the urgent and less time doing the genuinely important. And developing these science and technology partnerships is the important. There's this new impetus and realization that we're going to have to deepen S&T partnerships. And that deepening has to include universities, which is a traditional science diplomacy. It's going to have to integrate commercial enterprises in new ways, which is somewhat new. And it's particularly important because a lot of the lead scientists, even at the basic level on these foundational technologies, are obviously in commercial enterprises right now, not at universities anymore. And then, of course, it's going to have to include governments, which are going to have to incentivize and create these thick networks. So what happened in Japan 2 weeks ago? It got almost no attention in the United States, unless if you're really excited about science and technology diplomacy. But I think it's noteworthy because it suggests what the future of our agenda has to look like. One, the US and Japan launched a university partnership for workforce advancement and development in semiconductors. Tens of millions of dollars in partnership between Micron, 11 universities in Japan and the United States, and a series of Japanese firms, devoting tens of millions of dollars to creating workforce training and a research agenda around semiconductors. So you're solving your supply chain issue, you're deepening your ecosystem, you're confronting one of the challenges of foundational technologies, and you're doing it against the backdrop of intensifying geopolitical competition. So that'd be example one. Similar program just launched in Japan on quantum information science. So even further from direct application today, but with that long-term S&T investment required. 10 years, $100 million between IBM, Google, University of Tokyo to develop an educational program and actual quantum hardware in Japan that's going to create an entire new network of researchers and an entire new research agenda that is commercial, academic, and government driven all at the same time with the United States and its partners. And so that's the start of a new kind of technology diplomacy, S&T diplomacy, reflective of this era. I think it's just the beginning of that agenda. And if you look at the scale, it's a scale that's really not like how we used to think about S&T diplomacy. Even during the Cold War, where you're talking about small grants, small research investments, $1 million, $2 million. This is $50 million, $100 million, because it's now a techno-industrial issue, not just a basic science issue. And so the scale of these research partnerships is going to have to be transformed. What is this going to require? Well, as the secretary said, he'll be long retired before we get a chance to see whether or not these investments pay off. But it's the right approach. And that means it requires the kind of diplomatic capital, political capital, human capital to invest in these long-term investments to rewire ecosystems. And that's going to be hard. What is that going to require? It's going to require a cultural mindset by our diplomats. And I think it's also going to require a certain amount of cultural mindset change in the science and technology community that recognizes a convergence. It strikes me as if when you look at some of the reaction by the AI scientists to the current events, my favorite is Jeffrey Hinton, who was the academic researcher who went to Google and then resigned and is oft quoted in the last month or two. And he said, I'm not a policy guy. I just suddenly realized how dangerous these things were, but I don't really know what to do about it. And it seems to me when you're developing and building these really powerful technologies, we're going to have to build in a certain amount of geopolitical, economic common sense into these conversations as our scientists are developing these technologies, because they are going to intersect with diplomacy and geopolitics in fundamental ways. And we can't get to the end point in which a technology is deployed and suddenly realize we don't know what to do. Right. So for quantum computing, we've got enough of a warning that it shouldn't be an excuse. Bioengineering and biotechnology, we're rapidly getting to the point where we should probably have a lot better answers than we do today. AI will consume all of us for the next year or two to figure out what to do, but we didn't have to be in this position. And it's part of the job of diplomats to make sure, and our science diplomacy to make sure we're having these conversations before these technologies are deployed. I think if that's one lesson of the past decade, that's it. Secretary Blinken has also said, he joked when he was deputy secretary, so about 7 or 8 years ago, that he needed a technologist or scientist in the room with him just to know if he needed a technologist or scientist in the room with him. That actually dynamic has changed. We can't think about science and technology as a plug-in anymore, where we, just call our science person into the room every once in a while when it comes up. We're going to need our diplomats and our policymakers to have a sufficient level of proficiency on these issues that they're going to be able to understand and integrate these into their conversations on a daily basis. So I think that's the challenge that we have in the State Department. It's the challenge we have as we try and educate another generation of policymakers, is to make sure that that kind of technology literacy and science literacy is part of the conversation in international affairs in a way that it was not as in the past. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. And thank you for not asking me any questions about ChatGPT in this conversation. Oh,
exactly.
Oh, I didn't know we have an online audience. That's great. Okay, well then I will answer it now.
So the question is, will the US call for a UN agency to govern future forms of artificial general intelligence, not narrow AI like GPT that we have today?
Yeah. So there has been, there are a series of analogies that have been broached in the context of what to do about general purpose AI. They include an IAEA-like body for governing AI at an international level. And I think right now, what we're trying to figure out is what actually needs to be governed. What are the risks? What kinds of technical levels of expertise are required to actually make judgments about standards for safety, risk, performance? And then to understand whether or not it makes the most sense to pursue these again in a domestic regulatory governance framework or at an international level, and what that dialogue looks like. We've already agreed, for instance, at the G7 to talk about some of these and figure out what a normative framework would look like, what the basic conversation should be around these issues. But I think it's far too early to start calling for specific institutions. We're at the really front edge just of even understanding how these foundational models are working. And I think our policy solutions, even 2 months ago, if we would have proposed them, would have looked very different than they do today, and they're going to look different.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your remarks. I was wondering, what's the role of underdeveloped countries such as those ones in Latin America that are yet to develop a strong techno-industrial implementation within their own countries, and in the context of the United States and its foreign cooperation within other countries that do have a stronger industry within technology, such as the ones you mentioned, Japan, Korea, and such?
Sure. So there's a few different ways to answer that. The first, obviously, is the United States has always had a strong interest in making sure the kinds of scientific educational exchanges that are broadly equitable are encouraged. And so that's part is an educational component. The second piece of this, which I think is going to be really important in the future, is to have international conversations about how to govern these technologies. Our EU colleagues have led the way in one framework, and so these conversations, for instance, about what it means to govern responsible AI in a domestic context, they need to have irrespective of where any country is right now, because these technologies are going to be widely available everywhere, just like social media is widely available everywhere. So those kinds of conversations about rules of the road need to happen irrespective of a development level of a country where it is right now. And then there's a third issue, which is equitable access to high-end technology. So, there's a lot of concern that when you're talking about billion-dollar models with $100 million training runs for some of these AI systems, that the distribution of benefits will not be equitable. And I do think we need to work hard to find international or global solutions to make sure that if we assume these are not just going to have tremendous risks and existential dangers, but they're also going to have profound benefits for societies, that they're within reach of any country.
Thank you so much. Very enlightening presentation. With regards to the USA and their position on a global spectrum for science and technology, would you say that you find yourself in a Sputnik 2 moment?
So when I was at the AI Commission for 2 years between 2019 and 2021, we wanted people to pay attention to the importance of artificial intelligence. And we kept lamenting the fact that we had not had a Sputnik moment for AI. And we kept looking at the reaction of East Asia to Go, and the fact that, DeepMind had developed this computer program that could defeat Lee Sedol in this game, and it created this cultural phenomenon. So we now have our cultural phenomenon, which is ChatGPT. And so then the question is, what do we do? Right? It doesn't having the intersection of geopolitical risk, technological transformation, and cultural phenomenon, which I think this is a cultural phenomenon, if nothing else, opens up in a tremendously interesting policy space that does not prescribe a destination. And I'll give you, since I'm a historian, I'll give you a historical example from Sputnik. Little silver thing flashing in the sky. We actually knew it was going to go up. We actually had way better space capabilities than they did, particularly if you looked at our military side of these issues. Dwight Eisenhower said, well, why are we making a big deal about this? What are we really doing here? We're actually leading. This didn't surprise us, and it's just a little blinking flash in the sky. Of course, politics intruded, culture intruded. And so what did he do with this opportunity? Does anybody know what the most important impact of Sputnik was? Yeah.
It galvanized our defense and academic industrial base.
Transformed our academic research, right? Yeah, exactly.
Scared the crap out of it.
And that led then to the actual funding of the National Science Foundation. It led to actual funding, serious programmatic funding for our entire scientific endeavor. There was no reason that it had to do that. It was the interpretation and decision. And it also led to a whole series of investments in a broader educational suite as well. There was no reason that Sputnik had to do this. It could have just been military investments. It could have just been NASA, but they took this opportunity to transform the entire science landscape in America. So that's where we are now. The question is, how ambitious and bold do we want to be with this new moment to get things done?
Thanks for your thoughts. Appreciate it. My name is Nee Simmons. I'm with the Land Council as a non-resident senior fellow. I'm Ghanaian American. Both my parents are from Ghana, and there seems to be a newfound interest in Africa, especially when it comes to critical rare earth minerals. Without Africa, there won't be an AI revolution. A lot of our electronic devices, a lot of these things come from Africa. My question to you is, and there's been I've had members of staff of members of Congress reach out to me and try to get my thoughts because I've written some things, but what is the US government doing to, partner with emerging frontier markets like Africa, and also to do what you just said about the Sputnik, movement? What are we doing to support democratic partners in Africa and other parts of the world to develop their own industrial base so they can support Western supply chains? Kind of like what we did in Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s, we need to do in Africa. So what's your thoughts to that?
So, I mean, I think I agree with exactly what you described as the policy prescriptions. I think there's a broad recognition that industrial supply chains on the upstream side go back to actual geography, and much of that geography, as you said, is going to be in Africa. And so part of what we need to do is make sure that at the capacity building side, when contracts are signed, when decisions about mining rights are decided, that they're done in transparent ways, democratic ways, rule of law ways, so that they benefit countries, societies, not just kleptocracies. I mean, that's part of the issue here. And then the other part of the issue is to make sure, and we're doing this through something called the Mineral Security Partnership, that this is true partnership when we're thinking about supply chains, and that the upstream side is not the afterthought. Because right now, it's true, a lot of the attention is on the downstream supply chains, not the inputs. So I agree with you. I think we're about out of time. I want to make sure we have enough time for the.
Thank you. All right. And I'm going to hand it over to Scott Case, who's going to get on panel.
Hey, good morning, and my apologies for being late. My excuse is I was over at the State Department for a discussion this morning on their open forum on space and diplomacy. There's recently been a space and diplomacy framework that was just announced and put out. So for the points that just being made about State Department, people are going to have to know more about science technology, not just simply have this plug-in space guy in the corner that comes in, but a larger awareness of how space technology affects economic security and diplomatic interests. Well, you could really write the same thing more broadly for S&T policy more generally. The frightening thing, I think, maybe for some of our students is they're going to need to learn more science. So those of you who are coming to international affairs because you didn't want to take another math class, wrong. So this will be the future challenge, is to be literate across all these different fields. A group of friends and colleagues who in fact are literate across all these fields makes up our next discussion. I'd really like to invite the panel to come forward. Please take your seats. We have on the U.S. side, Jason Donovan. He's Director of the Office of Science, Director of the Office of Science and Technology Cooperation at the Department of State. Our space remarks are on video, so enjoy those later. We have Florent Bernard, the Science Counselor at the European Union delegation here in Washington, D.C. Welcome. For many years, we had a space counselor for the EU, I shouldn't ask. Okay. Well, he did a great job, and so I'm waiting for the next one. Meanwhile, we have a burden to carry. My friend Koji Arabayashi, the S&T counselor at the Embassy of Japan. longtime partner and colleague on all S&T issues, not just space. And from the AAAS, there we are, Kim Montgomery, and Director of International Affairs and Science Diplomacy. And AAAS, not only being a fine NGO, also has the privilege of having a large numbers of PhDs, relatively recent PhDs come through the AAAS Fellows Program, is a source of importing knowledge capital and S&T into the Washington environment. So we thank you for that. With that, let me just turn over, have each panelist will just proceed in sequence here. Jason, have you go first. Say just like a field hearing, 5-7 minute opening comment, and then we will go to discussion. Thank you, Jason.
You hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Elliott School. I'm delighted to see some old friends and new. I think Dr. Center did a great service by kind of framing the broader landscape of this set of issues. And I'll take as my piece of that to share with you all some of the specific ways in which the State Department is engaged to facilitate the kind of science diplomacy that he characterized within very much the framework that he outlined in terms of strategic competition, in terms of transformative technologies, in terms of the urgency and importance, both, not just important but urgent, or urgent important, but both urgent and important work of international engagement around this set of issues. I think the important fundamental point to make is that the notion of a science ecosystem is indeed a fundamentally and inherently international phenomenon. You're here because you care about international relations, so this won't come as a shock to you. But the scope, the breadth, the history of science development and technology development is fundamentally international in its dimensions. So there's a reason why the State Department and my office in particular has 60 different science technology agreements with different countries around the world. And are in fact actively still negotiating some. I look to our Canadian colleagues and to David Biggs from my team, who are very much in the thick of that process, and we're delighted to be bringing that together. But more broadly, the urgency and the importance of the present moment is not to be discounted. While there is a long history, the dynamics are definitely shifting in the face of the transformative technologies and strategic competition coming together at this historic moment. So I want to focus on a couple of dimensions around which we are responding to and helping to try to shape the nature of international engagements in order to ensure the kinds of democratic values that Seth mentioned, and to ensure that the technologies that are being developed and will transform our respective societies do so in such a way as to benefit our societies, and to uplift humanity and solve some of the most consequential challenges that we face, whether it's climate challenges. We haven't mentioned climate as yet, but that's obviously an important focus of the strategic environment as well, the current climate as well, the real risks that we face. Infectious disease, we haven't talked about in great deal either. Obviously, we're coming out of a pandemic that was global in scope, in which hundreds of millions of people were lost. So there is an urgency in terms of those issues as well. So I think there's no shortage of things to feel urgency around, but they're very much critical for the international collaboration around a way in which we choose to engage in cooperation on science technology and the uses to which we put those resources, right? So you'll hear from my colleague Florent momentarily, but one of the ways in which we are collaborating but not only with our Japanese colleagues in the G7 and bilaterally, but also with our EU colleagues, is on this agenda for research integrity and research security. They're very much interrelated, and there's a very vibrant series of conversations that include also the Global South. And I tip my hat to my EU colleagues for their efforts to widen the conversation beyond the developed countries to those developing countries that are seeking to have a voice and be heard in this conversation. We are very much welcoming of that initiative and are supportive of it, and have ourselves sought to elevate that as well. But that's a collaborative effort that we share. And in fact, building on the G7 principles, we've very much sought to integrate those into the wider conversations that we're having in fora that the EU and others are championing. I would mention just a few of our programmatic initiatives as well that the State Department is involved with. My office runs something called the Embassy Science Fellows Program, which has existed for a number of years. And what it does is we put out an annual announcement to all the embassies that we have around the world to nominate, come up with, suggest projects where U.S. scientists can meaningfully travel to or virtually spend several months in countries around the world to work on specific technology and science challenges. For instance, if Embassy Ankara, I was talking to our Turkish colleagues earlier, has an interest in developing a strategy for climate mitigation in Izmir, then it wants to have bring a scientist from the United States to develop a plan to do that, for example. I'm speaking purely hypothetically, of course, but this would be the kind of project that we would be able to receive and review and mobilize the U.S. science interagency to address. So there's an ongoing program. We have almost 100 different applications from around the world that we've been fielding, where we share our scientific expertise internationally on a very specific technological and science challenges. I see Linda Molnar in the audience from NSF. We're eager for her to engage on the circular economy and plastic pollution. But we deal with a whole host of different challenges that we face, whether they're climate focused, whether they're health focused, whether they're based on transportation infrastructure, whatever it may be. So that's a particular program that we use as a tool for science diplomacy. I mentioned the bilateral S&T agreements, science technology agreements. We have regular engagements where we bring the science interagency together and travel overseas. We just came back from Taiwan, where we were engaged with our colleagues on Taiwan in terms of public health, in terms of standards, in terms of quantum AI, a whole host of different science issues. In fact, that's where Florent and I met back in Brussels when we were doing our joint JCG meetings with the EU. And lastly, I would say that we have the ongoing conversations on the values framework. I want to say that before you have policies, before you have there are standards, before you have standards, there are values of cooperation and norms of cooperation. That's why we see that as foundational. There were some questions earlier about what kind of governance structures to have. Before we can have the governance structures, we need to have a foundation established on what kind of norms and values should shape the kind of interaction we have. And that's why we invest so heavily there. I'll stop there and look forward to your questions in the discussion afterward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and Jason, thanks for the great introduction from Seth and for your comment, Jason, and thanks for the Elliott School for welcoming this very much needed event. Actually, you said it all, so I would be tempted to pass my turn, but I'll take the opportunity to bring a bit of EU vision approach to this discussion. People who know me think I'm a smiley and nice guy. The reason is simple, not true. Yeah, I think you believe that too. The reason is that I'm being monitored and I need to make happy 27 different countries at any time. That's the EU. That's how the EU works. We are a supranational power, but still we rely very much on this making happy those 27 countries. And those are very different populations with very different ethical and ethos approach to life. The reason I'm saying that is because of this complexity and because of this necessity to make very different population happy with whatever we come up with, it makes us very credible. And and especially in this context of science and technology diplomacy, it means that we are reflecting a lot on before we launch something out in the world. And concerning this specific topic of science and technology diplomacy, we are in a turning point. The usual simple formula that we've heard before, like the market will solve it all or openness at all costs, are no longer valid. And we have realized that around 5 years ago now, and we have launched several initiatives regarding that. So the turning point is that we need to have a systemic approach. We need to be very careful in the different part of the system because the system is complex. We cannot no longer rely on having a uniform and global level playing field. Although the EU is still, despite whatever is happening in the world, we are still advocating for these global level playing fields, rules that we would all follow because they are good for everyone. And actually, most of the countries that have increased their economy in these recent 20 or 30 years have benefited from this level playing field. So we don't understand why now they are reconsidering this global level playing field. We are urging any countries to come back to that for the benefit of humanity and for the benefit of their own population. So this is very important. But sadly, we can no longer rely on this global level playing field, and we will still strive for it at WTO or in R&I cooperation. So the system is very complex. We have to be extremely careful. And actually, once this seminar ends, I encourage you to rush, not now, on the conclusion of the TTC that just took place. So I should maybe not say that, but the conclusion have been published now. You might be attracted to go and read them. Tempted to go and read them. So and this is a very good example of a systemic approach. As I said, that we have already embraced that approach for many years in a number of areas, and the Green Deal was a very good example. We're the first to tackle the planetary danger in which we were heading to, and we were the first to launch this Green Deal, which at the time was meant to be unrolled in a world with common rules. So the arrival of some subsidies from one side or unfair rules from other sides took us a little bit by surprise, and we need to adapt that, of course, to our strategy now. So, but we are very glad to see that the idea of the Green Deal was embraced by other countries, and we were very happy, of course, to see the move from the US towards reaching a net zero emission economy. The GDPR also was another very important systemic approach that we had in terms of privacy. And we see that state like California actually copy-pasted the GDPR after all the criticism saying that it will impair innovation. The place where the Silicon Valley is adopting this regulatory aspect. So this is what we call the Brussels effect. And my call to you is just embrace it. We have been really reflecting a lot on that for all part of society. So just do like California, like many other part in the world, embrace the Brussels effects. We have the right, we are coming with the right solutions. And by the way, because we're discussing the AI, that's our next Brussels effect. We will be ready to launch soon. Regulation doesn't impair innovation; it's the opposite. Regulation thrive innovation. Because it creates a very stable environment, a predictable environment. It might not be it might not be good for some companies that are already established, but it would allow newcomers to come with the right impact that we are looking for. So this is what the systemic approach we are trying to devise. And we have done the same for research innovation. So in 2018, I've been in charge, because I was in charge of the cooperation with China from the EU side, the EU point of view. I was in charge of drafting a strategy which is called the EU Global Approach to Research Innovation. And that was the first time we decided to revisit our open to the world strategy that we had for the many years in the Europe. And our first commitment in that global approach was making sure that openness is our default approach. We need to ensure that openness remains the way to cooperate internationally. And there was, of course, the little but of course, that Seth has mentioned and Jason have already mentioned. So we have embraced this view of as open as possible and as close as necessary. That is now being the mantra in many areas. We were also adding the layer of paying attention to values, as just Jason mentioned, and we have launched this multilateral dialogue on values and principle. Why? Because we were noticing that publications were not freely published anymore, that some countries were asking publication from universities to pass by the ministry before they would be allowed to be published. And there we thought, oh my God, this is really a big danger for science, for academic freedom, and for science integrity. And actually, I insisted a lot in the Global Approach to Research Innovation to add a sentence stipulating that the conduct of science relies on the refusal of the argument from authority. And it was not so evident because people don't understand that, but it's important that it's not because a scientific paper is published that it has not undergone some pressure or some censorship. So we have to make sure that academic freedom is still maintained. And this is one of the flagship that we are advocating now at the EU level. The global approach to research innovation has another important dimension, which is making sure that we're all working towards resolving the global challenges. Jason mentioned that also. It is of utmost important. But of course, we need to reflect of the systemic part of this. Cooperating on global challenges doesn't mean that we will not take actions when we see that the solutions for these challenges like climate resolution or clean tech deployment doesn't respect our level playing field. So we have, at the EU level, we have put forward a number of measures to correct these unfair practices that we have seen that are affecting our global level playing field. And just to finish, I just want to mention, because Seth was mentioning what is the next step, how can we have more cooperation internationally, what is the silver bullet for greater international cooperation. And I know that the US is reflecting on that. Again, the EU comes with a solution. It's called Horizon Europe. We call it Horizon Europe because it's mainly European public money, but it's actually already an international platform for researchers to cooperate. We are open to everyone in the world, and we're addressing through this program a number of grand challenges that are common to all of us. We are paying all researchers coming from middle and low income countries already, and we have associated to the program already 16 countries in the neighboring areas of the EU, but now we are increasing our reach, and we are on the process of associating New Zealand. We're in discussion with Canada and other countries present at this table. So we would like to advocate that Horizon Europe is a platform where everyone is welcome and could be the place for researchers to cooperate for a greater good. It's safe. It's under Belgian law. I'm from Belgium, that's what I say that, but it's also the headquarter of NATO, SHAPE, and of course the EU. So it's a trustable partner, but it's something we would like to advocate. We are offering this platform to the world, and we would like to welcome everyone to that. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Koji Aribayashi as Science Counselor at the Japanese Embassy. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. So I'm a chief of the science section at the embassy. So this science section is a very unique section. So looking at the all the world. Our U.S. Japanese embassy only has only the science section. So there is no other science section in other around the world. So that is why the Japan is thinking the collaboration with the US is very important from the viewpoint of the science and technology cooperation. And as the Dr. Center said, this month, we had many bilateral or multilateral dialogues. So especially that we had a bilateral meeting, high-level meeting with the US partners. So the head of the US is Dr. Prabhakar from OSCP, and the head of the Japanese side is two science and technology ministers. So during the meeting, we had a variety types of topics, so including the emerging technologies and the challenges we are facing now. So that is why our government is trying to facilitate the international collaboration with the like-minded countries to solve the challenges we are facing now. In addition to promote the science and technology cooperation, so we also consider the importance of how to use such a new technologies, including the emerging technologies. So for their responsible use, so when conducting the developing and research. In this regard, during the G7 Science and Ministers meeting held in Sendai in Japan this month, so the G7 ministers discussed and shared the recognition of the importance of such responsible uses of the new technologies. So I would like to follow up this result of the G7 discussions and with our colleagues to be here with it. And for the international cooperation, so in the science and technology, so I believe such a trust-based cooperation with the like-minded countries is the most important. I believe so. Yeah. And currently, considering the international cooperation in the field of the science and technology, so the Japanese government is trying to promote to establish the researchers, young researchers network. So between the foreign countries, it is a very important thing for our countries. So because these days, so the most young researchers tend to be reluctant to go abroad. So because the studying in Japan is very comfortable for them. So, but on the other hand, so the considering the speed of the technological development, the progress and the geopolitical threats, so that we need to establish the human relationship with the foreign countries. That's a very important issues. So that is why our government established a new large-scale fund to facilitate such a collaboration with the international partners. So now that we are considering how to implement this new initiative, but I'd like to the monitoring its progress. And then finally, that I'm very happy to discuss with you and our like-minded partners to how to promote our relationship today. Yeah, thank you very much.
First, I want to thank the organizers, especially Jonathan Adams, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I had the honor of speaking at a panel here last December, so it's great to be back at the Elliott School this morning. It was wonderful to hear the keynote address by Seth. I found his remarks to be insightful and also a great reminder on how things change and how, the influence of S&T has really changed over not a long period of time. It's a delight to be here with my fellow panelists. I have had the pleasure of getting to know them and look forward to working with them in the upcoming years. And as mentioned in the introduction, I'm the Director of International Affairs and Science Diplomacy at AAAS. AAAS was founded by scientists 175 years ago as a general scientific society. And it's evolved over time. It still is a general scientific society and it has members across the globe. AAAS's mission is simple but profound. It's to advance science, technology, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all, or put more simply, to advance science and serve society. And so it has 4 strategic goals to try to achieve that mission. And one of which is to build trust among scientists and broader communities, which includes the foreign affairs communities. And so that's why AAAS has an international affairs portfolio, and it's why we have a Center for Science Diplomacy. Both efforts I have the privilege of leading. I do want to point out, especially on the panel that I'm in, AAAS, as was already mentioned, is not part of the US government. Instead, it's a nonprofit NGO. Since I'm coming from AAAS and we're talking about science and technology policy, diplomacy, it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to start with the New Frontiers of Science Diplomacy, which was published by AAAS and the Royal Society of London in 2010. And the framework really lays out 3 dimensions to better understand the nexus between science and diplomacy. And so the first being science in diplomacy. And so that's really providing scientific knowledge and expertise to help inform diplomatic objectives. The second being diplomacy for science. So that's how can diplomatic initiatives help international scientific cooperation. And the third is science for diplomacy, which is really centered on how international scientific engagement can help advance diplomatic objectives, including how to use science as soft power to improve relations between different countries. And so the framework is certainly not perfect. I'm not arguing that, but I do think it provides sort of a useful structure for what we're talking about when we're talking about science diplomacy. And we're talking about science diplomacy. I always start from a position of optimism. I am an optimist. I believe in the power of science to engage and use as a mechanism to build stronger bilateral or multilateral ties. I think if I didn't believe that, I would have a different job, or I would hopefully have a different job. However, science diplomacy operates in a context and one that's become more challenging and complicated, as we've already talked about before. And as my colleague Bill Kohlglaser and I suggested in an editorial in Science and Diplomacy last October, one might argue that we've kind of moved from engagement and cooperation to competition and cooperation, which we've already talked about this morning. Governments are imposing new rules and restrictions on international scientific cooperation, and they're considering limiting the types of collaboration and the topics that can be done because of possible implications for national security. This shift is a reminder that science diplomacy is not above politics, but that's always been true. But in this changing and complicated landscape, it might mean that politics impact science diplomacy a little bit more. And when it comes to emerging technologies, in a separate editorial, Bill and I propose that emerging technologies propose several challenges to diplomacy. And so the first is they deal with many scientific fields that have diverse applications, some of which are unknown. The second challenge is that they have the potential for serious national security risks and risks that are constantly evolving. And then the third is they're the subject of tension across nations. And it calls for, we would argue, and we did, that it calls for a role for science diplomacy for all 3 of the dimensions of the framework I outlined earlier. And so if you start with sort of the science in diplomacy, which is focused on scientific expertise helping to inform diplomatic objectives, it's difficult to provide accurate information, and there's a risk that diplomats and policymakers may first not understand the technologies, They may not understand or comprehend the applications of the technologies, and they could either under or over estimate their potential impacts. And I think there's stories that we've heard of all three of those things. For the diplomacy for science dimension, which is focused on diplomatic initiatives fostering international collaboration, emerging technologies do propose serious potential national security threats. So what if a nation obtained a transformative technology that could disrupt a national economy or gain access to national intelligence systems? So those threats are real, but we would argue that those legitimate concerns need to be balanced with the need for continued international scientific cooperation, which also plays a vital role in increasing scientific intelligence, improving both domestic and worldwide scientific capabilities, and attracting foreign talent. And finally, for science for diplomacy dimension, so how can we use science as a mechanism to advance diplomatic objectives, including improving relations among countries? Emerging technologies can be the subject of pretty large diplomatic tensions. And so we're certainly seeing that between the US and China. And due to this, we would argue there's value and attract to increasing those kind of informal diplomatic tracks that can be focused on things like what are allowable research areas and rules for collaboration to keep some of those collaborations going. So in all three dimensions, science diplomacy has a role and will remain an essential tool for the scientific and foreign affairs enterprise. So even in this difficult and changing context, this is not the time to become cynical about the power of science diplomacy to affect change and reduce conflict. In fact, I would argue that this new era calls for increasing our efforts in these areas. And I'll end my remarks by saying that science diplomacy is about relationships. I often say that I am in the relationship building game, and relationships, like the trust that they are built on, are difficult to create, unfortunately very easy to break, and if broken, incredibly challenging to rebuild. So we need to work to maintain and strengthen our relationships. I want to thank the organizers again, my fellow panelists in the audience, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
And we have questions coming online as well as I could. Well, I sort of, I guess maybe we want to take on sort of moderator privilege. What are the biggest issues that you've seen within your respective governments in trying to do science and diplomacy? I mean, AAA is coming from the outside, but each of you are within your own sort of bureaucracies and talking about sort of science and diplomacy. Is it people don't recognize that there's a there, or they don't recognize how they can contribute to it, or what the significance of it is, again, compared to all the traditional demands of people's time? What are the biggest sort of barriers or obstacles you run into? Making 27 countries happy. One of them.
Oh my God. The barriers. So first of all, we advocate for reciprocity, and we realize that that level playing field we're looking to achieve is very hard. So this is the reciprocity aspect is one of the obstacles we've seen. We are very much like the US or Japan. We're very open. Any tech companies that has a subsidiary in Europe is considered as a European company and has access to all our research programs as a European company. And that's not the case in other countries like China. So, and we see that this impairs our cooperation in a number of scientific areas. Also, the long list of technology export control from some countries, which are not reciprocal either, could prevent the free flow of technologies or knowledge. And then lastly, the values, academic freedom, and the ethical components of research. We have engaged in all these three dimensions with our partners in several dialogues or fora. But we see that there are still sticky points, and that's the reason why we are responding also to that lack of reciprocity now. So according to our global approach to research innovation, our openness is conditioned to reciprocity. And this is very dear to our heart.
Thank you very much. So the points of the what is important for from the viewpoint of the science diplomacy. So I suppose so the considering the speed of the current technological progress. So it is difficult for a single country to complete the development of the new technologies and its supply chain. So that is why so we need to collaborate or more actively than ever. So in addition to promote the R&D itself, so we also need to consider how to apply those technologies in our actual society. So to make us to do such a rule making, so the international collaboration is essential, inevitable for our countries. Yeah, thank you.
Just make a very brief remark. I think, in fact, it was, I think Ursula von der Leyen who said that we're not decoupling, we're de-risking. And I think you may have heard Jake Sullivan's kind of echoing that focus in his statements at Brookings a couple of weeks back. I think that's an important kind of indicator of the fact that there is a cultural change happening. There is a changing awareness of the landscape in which we exist. This notion of the level playing field no longer being kind of the norm that, or the no longer something we can take for granted, shall we say? And so establishing the mechanisms by which we raise awareness of the real risks that threaten the project of open science and scientific collaboration is something we're very much in the middle of. So there's an important series of conversations that are happening, and they involve track 2, 1.5, as well as within the government agencies themselves. The science agencies have a different perspective than the national security agencies, for example. So there's a very important effort to meet in the middle and to come up with a balanced perspective on how to be clear-eyed about risk and also am supportive of the necessity of collaboration and cooperation within a competitive framework. So I think that's very much kind of where we stand in terms of that cultural transformation, that changing awareness of kind of where policy and science intersect. Thank you.
I certainly don't represent a government, but it's really nice to hear this notion of balance, right? And so I think that's what we've tried to argue in the past, right? Is to really, you have to balance real national security risk, which are really there, with the value and need to also have international scientific cooperation. And that's going to look different than it did before, right? And so you need to have those conversations of people that understand the security risks, but also then understand the scientific collaboration. And so what are the guardrails that you could still continue with different countries? Are those guardrails very different depending on what those countries are? I would assume that those answers are yes, right? And so those conversations need to happen. I've been on panels where people are like, I get to collaborate and do anything with anybody that I want. And it's like, no, you don't. And you've never had the ability to do that, first of all, but you certainly don't now, right? And so that doesn't mean that that's bad. It means that you have to be practical and come to it real-eyed. So I think it's that balance, which I think is a very tricky thing to get right. But I think that's what we're talking about.
I guess, well, Florent.
No, yeah, I just want to echo what Kim says, because we're many of us scientists also. Our world collapsed in 2018, basically, because we have been, as a scientist myself, we have been grown in the scientific spirit of what we are doing is for good of mankind, and we should collaborate with everyone who is conducting research. And so the waking up of this was really tragic, I think, because it's the scientists in Europe were involved in research that had questionable ethical background, and they didn't know about it, and they could not suspect that. So I think we have, of course, a position at government level, at organization level, but we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the scientists who are facing this new complexity, and which is and we need to accompany them. I mean, just we, for example, at the EU level, we publish, like many other countries, like in the US or the UK, we publish these guidelines on foreign interference, or the toolkit on foreign interference, sorry. But this is not enough. I mean, we cannot just give broad guidelines or toolkit. We need to accompany the scientists in this new world, which is counterintuitive for them, and it's counterintuitive for science, actually. So this is one aspect that is a big obstacle, is to get the message passed on to those who are practicing science.
I think actually that's a very nice lead-in actually to a point or a question. Is going to wearing an educational sort of hat. So we have colleagues in the computer science departments, as well as in the international affairs school and philosophy school, particularly sparked by AI issues that are seeing cross currents of interests. And one of the, I think, realities is if I'm looking at a STEM undergraduate or graduate student, or like a computer science major, I'm probably not going to be able to get him to go take a philosophy class, you know, and start, you know, reading a whole bunch of other stuff that's not really directly related, you know, to what he's trying to do. On the other hand, there is a demand, it does seem to be a demand for dealing with, say, the ethics of algorithms and so forth, that they want to have at. So I think a kind of a challenge maybe for the university is to produce a translation function across these areas, to be able to inject or insert lessons and experiences from international affairs and political science, philosophy, and other things like that, but to meet the scientists where they are, you know, and not drag them out of their natural environment, but make them more, again, not to make them experts or anything in these new areas, but to know enough to recognize when something is an issue and when they do need to. And I think that's somewhat conceited. I think that's somewhat what we try to do in our programs, is not try to make people experts in any one particular area, but know enough to go, there's something else here, you know, we should go point at.
Can I speak to this one? Because I was a philosophy major before I went to graduate school. Before I went to graduate school at MIT and studied science and technology policy. So I believe that and I said this earlier in my remarks, that I think before you have policy, you have standards. Before you have standards, you have values. So I really do believe that that's the foundation. And as educators, I would urge you to take a holistic perspective and to bring that multidisciplinary approach wherever you can, and try to instill in your students the value of seeing. The reality is we can't be siloed any longer. It's important that we work across those silos, we break down those silos, that we bring a holistic interdisciplinary approach to the challenges we face. That reflects better the true complexity of the world we're in, and the kinds of solutions we're going to need to mobilize to address those challenges. So I urge you to open up the aperture, broaden your horizons, embrace the interdisciplinary nature of the work that you do, and cultivate that in your own approach to your life, where you are hopefully feeling like you're making a difference in the world and solving the problems that matter that we face, right? I mean, ultimately, it comes down to how you want to be in the world, whether you're an educator or a student or a policymaker or whatever. Thank you.
My former physics colleagues, I think, still look down on me as having descended into policy.
No, it's more than interdisciplinary. It's again, I will come back with this word systemic. I mean, if you realize what scientific do today are solving the problems we have created ourselves. This is what we're asking them to do. Whereas 100 years ago, they were all working for the progress of humanity and making our lives better. And now we are just, because we didn't reflect, of course, it was not, we had another view of the world. We thought it was endless resources, but it's not. So now we are faced with asking the scientific community to solve the problems we have put ourselves into it, or voluntarily. So we can no longer accept that, oh, let's launch a new technology, it's good for humanity, per se, because that's our approach we had in the past. we have to reflect, and it's very hard, and I'm not saying that there should be responsibility, but this is something we have to reflect. Whatever we do, we have to put it in the systemic dimension, including the planetary boundaries, whatever, because the reflex also beyond science is, oh, whatever the market accepts is good because the market rules and decides. No, because a lot of products that are put on the market are exploitative of nature and destroy nature. It's not, so it doesn't mean because you buy something that is good. So we have to really have this systemic approach. Whatever we develop, is it respecting planetary boundaries? What will be the impact on ethical, on society, and so on, before we launch or before we decide to go in that directions? And we have choices. I mean, this is very important. Nobody obliges to go with technologies that destroy nature. It's just a choice that we made. And I think this is very important.
I guess I was going to look at both to Koji and Kim. We talk about this balance idea. Where does that occur? Does it occur inside an individual's mind who's interdisciplinary and exposed, or and they're wise, or does it come out of maybe conflict and intellectual combat in the interagency process? As you bring stuff up. I mean, my own personal experience is policymaking is not a smart person writing something down on a piece of paper. It's very much intellectual conflict between competing interests that all have their own validity, but then have to, and there needs to be a way to have that combat and to escalate it and to have a process that allows you for that kind of resolution, as opposed to merely having an ongoing academic debate.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it seems to be a little bit to answer correctly. So however, in Japan, our new basic science plan strongly recommended to involve the social scientists in promoting the R&D science and technology activities. So that is the new tendency. How to involve the social scientists in the discussion with the actual society. So our government is considering how to establish a systematic scheme to accomplish these goals. So however, so far we are now under consideration, but so I would like to learn a lot from our counterparts during this meeting. Thank you very much.
I think you've brought up a ton of things. I do want to say that when after my postdoc, I came down to be a AAAS SDPF fellow, and everybody in the lab was like, so you're leaving science. And I was like, well, I don't think I'm leaving science. And so I often tell that because it's like, we need to also open what science means and who's involved with science. And I think that literacy, as even Seth was talking about, goes both ways. Like we've talked a lot about having policymakers and diplomats have more science and technology literacy, but I think the flip side is true too for people that are doing science and technology. And we've talked about that here. I tend to think about when you're listening to some of these people who are now reflecting on sort of AI, and it's like, well, I've created this and now I think it's really, really bad and we should pause it. It's like, well, the conversation of pause isn't now, as Seth was saying. It's like, 10 or 20 or 25 years ago. And it's a lack of also understanding policy and ethics on their part too, right? So both of that goes both ways. In terms of where the balance lives, I think that's a really, really good question that I don't have a great answer for. Like certainly it needs to exist in plans and policies and regulations, but how you get there. I think when I was working on the House, we used to say, like, if everybody was upset about a bill, then maybe that was the right bill, because it's like you kind of got to a point where it's like everybody had to kind of give up a little bit of their legitimate priority.
Optimistic about the debt ceiling.
I am. I'm not optimistic about McCarthy staying speaker, but I am optimistic about the debt ceiling.
Well, I think one of the things about that, again, in terms of having the literacy go both ways, while at NASA and other places, it was very, very common to see some very technical person come to Washington and do a tour, or a AAAS fellow and so forth, and sometimes our students, and go, oh, if only those politicians knew more science, they would make better decision making, you know, and I know science, so I'm going to hear and make it better. And then after about 6 months, they go, oh my God, my colleagues have no idea how this thing works.
Yes.
You know, and so I think, first of all, a little humility about, you know, how something really works is important, to kind of suspend your, maybe, if you will, your normative prejudices, and just kind of go, okay, how does this really work? And learn from it.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think you really have to have these sort of shared experiences and being open to the fact that you don't know that this is also a complicated thing. And there are really smart people that are working on these issues too. Because you see that a lot. You see that evolution where people are like, oh, I wrote this paper and this should just be the law and this will be fine. And then it's like, that's not how this system works. And you're really new to this system. Right. And so like the humility can go a long way. And I actually think the fellows that stay and do a lot of success, whether they go back or not, have that humility. And the folks that don't kind of do a tour and then kind of aren't so successful.
And maybe a way, and giving your Hill experience, sometimes what's helpful, and this is maybe where track 2 and track 1.5 and NGOs, of course, can play a helpful role, is to export some of those discussions to other entities to fight it out among themselves. Miniature example. In NASA, we would have decadal surveys from the National Academy of Sciences to set priorities for earth science, astrophysics, heliophysics, and so forth. And they would go off and fight among themselves and come up with priorities. And the Congress generally loved these, not because they understood the reports, but because the relevant community went out and prioritized the reports, so that they themselves didn't have to try to pick among different science projects, but they would say, oh, are you following the decadal survey, NASA, you know, or not? Now, that's a much more bounded example, but the degree to which you can kind of force debate into a forum and let that thrash out among itself can be very advantageous to the political process, who can then come in a bit later. Yeah.
I just would draw an analogy between what you've described in the NASA environment with what I think Linda's colleague, Rebecca Kaiser, is trying to do from her perch in the National Science Foundation, which is to engage the academic community themselves in the study of what it constitutes research integrity, research security. It's very common, as you know, to study national security issues or economic security issues, but to get the academic community focused on its own ecosystem and ask what constitutes the threat to research security that we face internationally? What are some of the mechanisms for incentivizing academics and research institutions and corporations, for example, that are also doing important research to mitigate those risks, is indeed, I think, a very important way for the academic community to engage in its own self-reflection on kind of this changed environment, right? So I would very much heartily encourage that line of inquiry. Thanks.
I'm having a fun time here, but do we have any questions here and there? Oh, there's one. Dara?
Sorry.
Dara, go ahead.
You
got it.
Okay, so there are 2 online questions. The first one is, which are the boundaries between science diplomacy and tech diplomacy from an implementation policy and stakeholders engagement perspective? The first one is this, and the second one is diplomacy is getting channeled more and more through ad hoc coalitions. What about moving up these agendas to international organizations?
So the difference between science diplomacy and tech diplomacy, my immediate reaction is tech diplomacy has people that have more money.
I like
First reaction. Oh, did I say that out loud? And the second one, but it's an important distinction. And the second one is about really international organizations. I assume sort of multilateral engagements for these things, both governmental as well as non-governmental coalitions, building coalitions, these groups.
Okay, I can jump on that. Yes, science on tech. I guess we all agree science would be defined as what we will publish publicly, so that there is an interest to remain open and get as many people working together towards that aim. Whereas when we speak about technology, there is a market component, IPR dimension that comes into play, which renders the dialogue and the cooperation much more difficult, and where we need, of course, to have agreement on how to handle these issues. So for science diplomacy, I would say that what is important is the openness and the ethical dimension and the integrity. So those are the components. For tech, it's the IPR and the export restrictions. So that, just like that.
So it's very interesting because not only the openness issue, but it flows over into regulations, because we have a fundamental science exemption, you know, like in our ITAR export control rule. You can find it in the physics book. You know, you can't control it that way. But sometimes there's boundary lines. I knew of cases before recent round of export reforms the past several years ago, where academics were not teaching as much as they could to audiences which had international students in them, because of fear of coming up against the edge of what might be considered ITAR, you know, guidance and navigation or rocket propulsion or something like that. And so they were kind of self-censoring, you know, and pulling back, you know, from where they thought that edge was. They didn't think the line was as bright as others maybe thought.
No, and I was just going to follow off of that. I think that line also might become increasingly challenging and blurred with sort of the geopolitical situation that we're in. So if you really are talking about sort of, you know, collaborations with China, where does that line go? I think there's a lot of people that are worried about people wanting to redefine what fundamental research is and what that can include or not. And so I think that's an ongoing conversation. So I think they were easier to tell before. I think they still are differentiated, but it's becoming more complicated.
So as an example, I don't know if you've run into this. If you look at, say, the commodity control list that Commerce does versus the U.S. munitions list that State does, there's also a cultural difference between these two. The commodity control list tends to be very bureaucratic, but I think in a very predictable way. You know, is it this big? Is it painted this color? What does it do? And you can tell very easily whether it's, you know, controlled or not, maybe speaking very generally. Whereas material on the munitions list is much more capability focused. This could be used in a nuclear weapon. It might be put on a military platform. So and that's intentional, because it leaves room for foreign policy interpretation. And so it's intentionally gray and capability oriented. So industry likes the more predictable, crisp, you know, kind of thing that's in the CCL, but the foreign policy community, because it can't predict everything, actually values the uncertainty and grayness over there. I don't know how those two cultured people have tried to put together a single list. I don't think that's really ever worked yet, because you have two competing purposes, you know, for the lists.
Yeah, I don't want to, I just like to add one more thing. And I think it's Florent talked about this as well, is kind of taking those scientists who are not used to either of the lists you just mentioned or any sanctions list or OFAC list, and realizing that they might need to be more familiar with some of those lists and sort of taking that journey and what's the role of helping them on that journey as well.
One of my briefing slides is a picture of a University of Tennessee professor who was sent to prison.
Yep.
For violating those rules. And I just simply say, oops, don't be him.
Yeah.
You're
I know there was a question about coalitions. Yeah, I mean, I think the EU is a coalition of 27 countries, right? No, but I the importance of them for go ahead. International organizations. Okay.
There seems to be a lot of that in climate, you know, but maybe are there other areas where coalitions?
Oh, we have, I mean, there are hundreds of international platforms already. So actually the scientists of the world already cooperate. Health, I mean, the NIH and the European Commission have launched a number of platforms, cancer, on rare disease, that are really working really well. And then we have, I mean, you just named the topic, there probably is an international platforms. So they take different formats. Most of them, it's heads of research agency gathering to decide on the programming. So where the money will be dedicated, to make sure that it's complementary and that researchers will work together on those strategy. We have a great cooperation that started between the US, Canada, and the EU on ocean, transatlantic ocean, and we had a great event last year on that topic, and which was joined by all the more countries like Brazil on the both sides of the Atlantic. So the same is happening with Arctic polar research now. So, I mean, I believe that the scientific community has understood really well that, again, it's a natural drive for them to cooperate internationally. It has always been the case, and I like to recall that that's how it started in Europe 2,000 years ago, with the Greek scholars going around the Mediterranean, traveling, and every time there was this open, and it started continuing in the Middle Age when the universities were created. They created networks of different universities, where Oxford didn't join at first, and and they changed their mind later on. And then, oh no, they're coming back. So this is a natural, I mean, I want to insist on that. It's a natural process for scientists to create, to cooperate. What is blocking them is the way the state organize their funding, because there's always taxpayer money, of course, so it's limited to the researchers in that area. And this is how we need to facilitate a little bit the access to these platform and cooperation.
Yeah, there's a question in the back.
Thank you to all the panelists. I was really intrigued by all the comments in your presentation. Again, with the underdeveloped countries, and I guess I should present myself. My name is Ana. I do tech policy for my country, which is Ecuador. And in my experience, I've seen that underdeveloped countries tend to be struck by conflict very often. And this has a consequence in two ways. First of all, it hinders their diplomatic relations. And second of all, it makes technological innovation not a priority. It comes at the bottom of the list. So my question goes to all of you. What can we do to give a helping hand to these countries that are struck by conflict? Because again, we're trying to level the game field, right? And how do we help them participate in these conversations, even though they have this complicated political situation going on back home?
Okay. You want to go? Okay. Well, just thanks for the question. Muchas gracias. Well, we have had for many years at the European level dialogue with CELAC, so the Community of Latin American Countries, and we have a research innovation dialogue where we discuss the priorities together with them. And again, most of Latin American countries are welcome to participate and be funded by the European Union Horizon Europe program. So this is how we proceed at the EU level. You are welcome to join our consortia. We're encouraged that we have a strategy for that. This can be found online. I can share that with you. And of course, the strategy is adapted to the needs of the countries. We have, for example, I mean, for the other part of the world, we have a very strong strategy with Africa, both on innovation to foster young innovators from African countries, but also on research in areas like health, water, and food security, which are the areas that are most at stake. So we do a refined way of cooperating, and we are opening our funding schemes and our platforms to everyone.
I would just add that there's a host of U.S. programs as well. We have Murphy Fellow here as well from Latin America, but the International Visitor Leadership Program, there are numerous programs that we have, as well as lots of bilateral dialogues. Alexis Valdivinos from my staff is here. He's in regular dialogue with counterparts across the Latin America on science collaboration and innovation opportunities. But to your point about conflict, I think, there are different levels of conflict, right? Obviously, if there's a full-blown war on, obviously doing science research is challenging, right? We've in fact been working with scientists and entrepreneurs in Ukraine along with EU counterparts. We've been collaborating on trying to help ensure that the science ecosystem in that country, which has been brutally attacked by the Russians, to be resilient in the face of that onslaught. And there are numerous ways that we've sought to do that. So obviously, you have the extreme case where there's a war on. But there are many different gradations of that. There are challenges within the United States in terms of polarization and kind of political conflict, trying to get to a consensus view on where we need to put our resources. So, I mean, there's a full spectrum in there, and I think one needs to try to work where one can to find those opportunities to build resilience. Thank you.
There we go. Good morning, Nee Simmons again from Land Council. Bonjour, Florent. This is, I guess, to you. EU has passed EU version of its own CHIP Act. I'm just wondering, maybe you can talk to this or you can't. How is Horizon Europe trying to integrate into that act? Because with the US CHIPS Act, we've done a decent job to integrate, academic institutions, NSF, others. What is Brussels doing to say to companies like Infineon, we will assist you to develop capabilities for tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers for inputs to semiconductors, flash memory, that sort of thing. If you can answer that.
Okay, I can answer to the limit of my knowledge. So it's important to remind that our program Horizon Europe represent only 5% of the total money available in Europe for research innovation. So we act more as a crystal, let's say, that grows with the member states funding. So the idea is to direct, to have a strategy that member state can adapt to if they want to, and mobilize their money. So that's what we've done with the CHIPS Act. We've mobilized a number of money for the actual production of chips. Member state complement that, and they can be host of manufacturing facilities, of course. But at the same time, we heavily funds at European level and at member state level, the development of semiconductors. Actually, we have the greatest center in Leuven in Belgium. It's called IMEC, which has been named the best incubators in the world. You can applaud to that. And so I think we have invested. I mean, this has been a very long 30-year strategy, and it's being paid off on the research and development level. And this is, we are continuing the strategy. Now the challenge is bringing the manufacturing and not be so dependent on other countries. So, but for your question, we're taking care of that within Horizon Europe, but also at national level for the countries who are involved in the chip and semiconductors value chains.
I actually wanted to go back to Nee's earlier comment and also about African communities, and then reiterate what Kim had said, which I really appreciated, that we need more scientists who are learning about policy and more policymakers who are more engaged and educated in science. And I wanted to bring up another community, because in the federal government, we often talk about government, academic, and industry partnerships, which we need to think about right now. We're asking the scientific community to solve societal problems, things like the pandemic, things like severe weather change. So is there any discussion around how we can engage more with the communities? Because I think that's the fourth stakeholder group that we really haven't mentioned, the actual communities that are impacted when we talk about bringing manufacturing back to the US for security reasons and our partners across the EU. So did any of the panelists or moderator have a comment on that?
Linda, thank you very much for your question. It's a really important one. And I think when we talk in the abstract about using science to solve real problems, it's important to have communities' voices kind of as inputs to help direct resources to solve those problems. I would mention, I mentioned the Embassy Science Program earlier. There's an initiative called SANO that Alexis was involved with in Latin America. There were, I think, 2 or 3 different Embassy Science Fellows who did programs on public health in Latin America. And they each were kind of looking at public health challenges from a different dimension. And they decided to work together to come up with a holistic One Health kind of approach where the voices of the community and their public health needs were factored into a discussion about health policy and how to improve health policy and health cooperation and collaboration internationally. So that led to an organic initiative that brought together how many countries?
The entirety of South America, about 155.
Okay, 155 stakeholders, the entirety of Latin America, South America, in that initiative, and it's now in its, I think, 2nd year. It's becoming a regular feature of this effort to share knowledge about how to optimize health delivery systems for indigenous populations, for example, how to translate into the indigenous language the medical text, the practitioners' handbooks, those kinds of real kind of getting science to the last mile, right, to the people who need it. And that was as someone who started his diplomatic career in Guatemala, which has one of the largest indigenous populations in Latin America, that was deeply meaningful to me because it also had the 2nd lowest social development indicators after Haiti in the hemisphere. So I very much appreciate the meaning and value of going that last mile and having those voices be part of the discussion at the outset so that you're directing resources in that way. Sorry, Kim.
I was just going to say at AAAS, there's a whole host of programs, and Sudip Parikh, our CEO, often says that we've moved from sort of, we want to engage the public because there's different publics, right? And so he's like, we want to actually pick a couple of groups in the public and be successful, right? Versus just sort of screaming about science to the general public, as I remember people talking about. And so AAAS has a lot of programs. One that I think is really fascinating is about building relationships with the faith community. And so it's trying to build those relationships before you need it. And I think I mentioned them first because you mentioned the pandemic. And certainly we had whole conversations about why you shouldn't sing in church because that could actually spread the pandemic. And Sudip always says you need those people that you trust that are right there telling you that information, then someone swooping in from DC suddenly telling you that a scientific study said that. We also have conversations with judges because you're also seeing that a lot of sort of science policy is happening at the court level. And so do people actually understand AI or quantum? I don't, I shouldn't be making those decisions. And so judges, we have those kind of collaborations as well. We have a whole program connecting scientists and journalism that's called SciLine. And so they have a database of scientists that are local to that community. Because again, if something's happening in my home state of Missouri, it would be a lot better if a scientist from, Mizzou was interviewed than somebody from, no offense to GW, was interviewed, just because they'll have that local relationship. And so I think that's a turning point from AAAS to say who are the key sort of societal groups in the public, and let's actually have targeted programs and build those relationships before we actually need them.
And I think this kind of brings up a larger issue, which we unfortunately don't have time for today. But it's really is the issue of sort of trust. Okay, I mean, there's trust within the scientific community, lack of it sometimes, research integrity. There's trust with the people who are using the science, people who are being impacted by it. And, it's pretty easy to tick off a long series of cases where there has been a decline in trust for all kinds of reasons. And everybody gets to participate in that decline. And so thinking through ways of fixing that, not by appeals to authority, but by appeals to localization, to transparency, to showing of mutual benefit or participation, so forth. I think it's very tempting sometimes for people to get frustrated, just sort of pound the table and do this because I say so, or the science says X, as if science is a singular noun. So I think reflecting on that, how do you build trust in the communities that are impacted by this is something all of us can reflect on. Yeah.
So trust, but also choice. I think it's also up to the communities to choose the directionality of the science and the innovation that they want to. I give an example. You're aware of this robot contest taking place in the US. So what do typically? There are robots that fight each other to see who is the winner, with a spirit of competition. It's great. I saw a robot contest in, I think it was in Nigeria. And the contest was which robot is going to help the grandmother to plant the seeds in the field. And that was the objective of the technology. It was not to kill another robot, it was to help the community. So I think this is very important to give the voice to communities, also to make the choice of what type of technology is going to develop. But most importantly, talent is random in the population. And this is something we always forget, is that you have an untapped talent in communities that are not exposed so much to talent. And a way to do that is to have closer access to science by, I know that in Europe, we have now this new European innovation agenda where the mayors of small cities are encouraged to develop their technology program, open incubators, local incubators, and so on, so that to give more access to people from high school and so on, so that they get exposed and they can realize if they have talent or not. And by the way, it's not just talent, but science is also the best social ladder that exists, because once you get into science, you're really for sure gonna get a very good job. So that's accessible to everyone. We've seen, I've traveled in several countries in Africa also, and I've seen in Rwanda, for example, they had those incubators where they give access just with a computer, and the student can go and self-taught how to code, and they came up with applications that were bought after by big companies, and they made really breakthrough because they knew what the issues were at stake and how to solve them. So I think it's really important, the community, for the choice, for the access, but also for making sure that we tap into this talent and they find a solution that are adapted to those situations.
And noting that we're a bit over time, I'm going to spare you from any long closing remarks, because really the panelists and you are the ones who've added most of the discussion. But if people want to hang around afterwards and chat a little bit, that's great. But I'd really like to just invite a round of applause for our great panel. I have a public service announcement from my dean. Please.
I have one question for you, and I have one announcement to make and a few thank yous. So the question for the panel is, my impression in this discussion is that the key word here is global governance. Is this my understanding, or I understood wrong? That technology, innovation, science, whatever, they have reached the point where we need a little bit better global governance, not just national. Am I correct, wrong here?
Depends on what you mean by
That's why I'm putting it in the big powers here.
I think there's agreement that there's a need for very strong international collaboration in this area. I don't know, global has the implication of it being one solution for the whole globe, whereas I think what we need are more nuanced kind of collaborative approaches in depending on the issue area where we're looking. Thank you.
Yeah, let's start with something simple, then global governance. So maybe level playing field, agreeing on and reciprocity. I think those are the two words.
Thank you very much. So taking into the rule making of the new technology, so that the single countries cannot achieve such a goal. So that we need to the international governance.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think my other panelists are more better at answering that question, but I think I would say that whatever in those conversations we're having, whether they're on standards or all the way up to global governance, it's really this balance of making sure that we're not hindering collaboration that should be done.
So at the Elliott School, our thinking is that our societies reached points in the past where we decided to do international organizations for finance, next door. International Organizations for Development and Poverty, next door, and many other things like this that are important. And whether technology and whatever that means has reached that point where actually we are at an aha moment. All those beautiful technologies you mentioned, that we need this. Having said that, at the dean's office here at the Elliott School, there is significant thinking, and although we have a lot of institutes, if there will be a next, it will be on global governance. So the school is thinking to invest its own money as seed money on an Institute of Global Governance. I personally want to have a big infusion of science, technology, and innovation, but it will not be only on those. It will be on other issues as well. And that institute, if it happens, is going to be led by probably the most famous professor of ours in political science, who just last week won the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in political science. This is Marty Finemore. Marty is a very famous professor here at GW. Together, I have it in front of me. The prize is the Skite Prize. It is also Swedish, like the Nobel Prize, and it's supposed to be the Nobel Prize of political science. And Marty's work has been on what political scientists call constructivism. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But we have this discussion with the Global Governance Institute has been going on for about a year now in the dean's office. We did not know that Marty actually will win this prize, but she was one of the two people that we have identified for leading this kind of institute. So stay tuned. We may have some news if everything succeeds. You know, there's bureaucracies here, and there's so finally, I want to close this by thanking everyone, thanking my colleague Scott Pace for leading this, Aaron Bateman, very much Deria Buyuktaner, who is actually the person behind all this organization, and Adam also. Back there. So the Elliott School benefits very much by these discussions. We really are thinking very seriously of how to stay at the forefront of issues, of international issues. And we believe, well, I am biased, of course, but I think many other people believe in the school that technology, science, innovation are actually some keywords for the future of humanity and for this planet. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thanks.